an opportunity to take the maximum advantage that we have of a period that is really less than 2 hours and involves three speakers.
Víctor, espera un segundo.
Three speakers, and so let me encourage you to take your seats so that we can get our next speaker underway. And I think we stand a chance to becoming much more informed about this sector of transport than most of us were before. Our first speaker this afternoon is Mr. Nestor Roa, who is Chief of the Transportation Division of the Department of Infrastructure and Transportation of the Inter-American Development Bank. And in the bank before arriving at this position, he was in charge of several transport, telecommunications, and energy projects. And before that, in Colombia, in the National Department of Planning, he was Chief of Transport and Infrastructure. So he's been at the center of a lot of the problems and the partially answered questions that we have been dealing with before. Nestor?
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Special thanks to the government of Colombia. As a Colombian, it's a real pride to be here representing the IDB and the transport sector of the IDB. Thank you to the ambassador, the general consul, vice consul for the great organization that we have, and for Harvard and MIT. It's really also a pleasure to share the tables with so many great professors and professionals in the field. And that presentation is really compromising because I have been like a lot of time before the bank in the government of Colombia, so probably I'm responsible in very part of many of the things that are being discussed here, which makes them a lot interesting to see the situation now. But beyond that, then I went to the bank, and I have been for 12 years doing kind of the same type of things in Latin America for the rest of the country. So it's really interesting from the numbers that we are going to see now. But that's what I want to start with the disclaimer. And this is really hard to do. And that's, we were talking with the professors before during the break. And doing transport is really difficult. And I was this morning thinking about it in the airport when I was planning to take my 6 a.m. flight out of DC to come here, and I was really worried the day before that because of the sequester, I was going to get delayed. I understand that the 10% cut-off hours of all FAA personnel is going to is creating. I think it's near 50,000 people in the FAA. Is creating close to 1,200 flights delayed. So I was really worried, and that's particularly one of the situations that you can see. Maybe 1 second. I want to get directly to this graph. Is that this is complicated. I mean, if you think that you just take the 10% of the people of one of the most sophisticated systems that you have in the world, and to create that type of problem, is that we really are taking are having enhance a system, a problem that is really difficult to do. And if you look at the numbers here, which is basically a representation of the different infrastructure systems in the developed world, in the emerging Asia, and in Latin America, you see that actually air transport, and Professor de Neufville will tell me, is probably one of the things that we better do in all the places. You know, you see a lot of in the index of quality of infrastructure, you see that the developed world is air is the one in gray, which is very high, even in Asia, and even in Latin America, it's kind of high compared to energy, where we most of the time have, most of the country we have a big coverage, but we still, when a storm comes in DC, I have been without power for 2 weeks, something that never happened to me in Colombia, and I can't imagine what will happen if you have the spread damage that you have here in Colombia, but probably that will be 1 year. So this is something that is really hard to do. And actually, I want to go a little bit into the case of roads, which are probably the simplest technology of transport that we have. It's just laying asphalt, usually most of the time, and moving earth and minerals from one place to another. Technology is not as complicated as rail, for example, or has an airplane or an airport. And if you look what's happening in roads, you are all over the place. This is the Latin American figure. The countries that have a better behavior in the percentage of paved roads are small countries in the left side on your side. And then you see all the other countries with really actually very mediocre, and this is not urban. This is mostly rural coverage. So we are not being able to build the roads that we need for development and of all that and it's relative. When I say relative, is that I used to work a lot on Honduras when I was a specialist. Now that I'm chief of the transport division, I spend more time in Honduras, and we are doing very simple projects there, but in relative terms are very complicated projects for that setting, or even compared to the projects that you may have in Colombia, which are actually very high end if you think in the general framework of Latin America. So that's the message that I want to leave here, that what we are trying to do is complicated, it's not easy, and we need to do a lot of things. Let me jump to this slide. This slide basically shows that it's not only complex, but it's also very expensive. It's very expensive what we need to invest. A kilometer of new build road, just 1-2 lanes, could be $1 million, $2 million. That's very expensive. If you think, for example, in a small town in Colombia, who probably receive maybe 20 kilometers of network, and you are thinking a town of 10,000, 20,000 people with not having to manage an asset of $30 million, that's really difficult to do. And you also see here how we are investing around the animations are not. We're investing at the beginning of the 80s around 4% of GDP, in the mid 80s, in transport in highway infrastructure, and it went down to 2.8 in 2010. So actually, it has been going down. Public expenditures have been going down. There was an attempt to substitute some of that investment with private funding, and that's what basically went to ports and airports. That's what we have some better systems in that area in Latin America. But what is really complex here is that it's very expensive. It's a lot of money. 4% of GDP, you make the numbers, is a lot of money, but it's too low. We should be investing around 6 or 6.5% of GDP in this type of infrastructure in order to get to the point of investment that the East Asia did in the 90s. So we are kind of far away in that hand. It's hard to do, it's expensive, and it's in all over Latin America the same situation. You see how, if you remember the first graph, Bolivia here is one of the countries that is investing a lot in highways, and they are still very far away in the pecking order of which countries are having more problems. And you see here the case of Colombia, Mexico, more or less around. And if you see that the quality of the roads is relatively low, I think we have a big challenge there. If we were to catch up, we will probably need private investing to grow from 1%, which is what we are seeing currently in this sector, up to 2.5%. We're talking probably 100 billion per year, and that's the IDB is disbursing every year like 2% of that. So that's the size of the issue that we have. So all multilaterals probably close to 10% of that every year in the transport sector. So it's a big challenge. But guess what? That's the old problem. We still have to do that task, and we have to do it. There is no other way around. We need to do the roads. but I think Lina was saying at the beginning, at some point, that Latin America is mostly urban. And it's not only mostly urban, but also it's going to be the most urbanized continent in the future, but also we have a big concentration of urbanization in the small cities and medium cities, where we need to do a lot of work, and you see the great work that Colombia is doing in the planning of that part. And so we already have the Mexico cities, the Sao Paulos, the Bogotas of the world, but we need to work in the other ones because they're going to continue growing, and we don't want those cities to become another Sao Paulo or another problem that is actually very difficult to manage. What this means, that it's more complex. Urban settings are more complex, but not only are more complex, are more expensive. So the percentage of investment that we need compared to GDP, which is already too low, needs to go up. So we have a big issue in financing. Now, that's the challenge, and I think it can be done. It's being done in some places in different ways. And now I want to talk a little bit about what the bank is doing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the IDB. One thing that I would like to make clear is that it's different when the World Bank was mentioned a lot in the prior presentation. We're not the World Bank, we are the IDB. And we have basically, it's a regional bank. Actually, it's the oldest multilateral bank. We have 26 countries who are borrowing countries and 22 extra-regional countries. There is a big discussion that we can give around the flexibility ideas in the multilaterals, and it has to do with that composition of the shareholders of these organizations, which is actually manageable. I think that the World Bank is probably a little bit more difficult in that regard. And the lending that we have accumulated is around $200 billion during the whole life of the bank. So if you think of the numbers that I just mentioned, it's really hard. So the bank has an equity, it goes to the market, has a AAA rating, we get funding, and we use some instruments to have interventions in different sectors. The bank was born as an infrastructure bank. Today is an institution that is trying to reach other sectors and find synergies between the sectors. That's where transportation is. It's more on the line of competitiveness, although we know that indirectly through competitiveness creates economic growth and will impact poverty, one of the mandates of the bank. But we know that one of the challenges for transportation, for example, is decentralization. We were just talking about that Colombia is probably one of the countries that has been more successful in decentralizing, but that's the big challenge that we have ahead in most of the countries. Many of these infrastructure, particularly roads, need to be managed at the regional, at the state or city level, and that's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we use several instruments to do our work. We have loans that are either policy-based loans that we lend to the governments with no specific use and they will be the compromise to put in place some policies. That is being less used nowadays than before. We have investment loans. We finance just specific projects or projects that are going to be defined during the execution. And in those cases, we may be able to prove some of the great ideas that we were listening in the prior presentation. We do lending for private sector and for public sector, and for private sector. For private sector, we are basically trying to mobilize other private funding, reduce the perception of risk or the real risk that they perceive in the structuring of the program, and that's where we can work with either non-sovereign with public entities or private sector. And also we do have other modalities of technical assistance, usually non-reimbursable, that are try to be related to the projects. So that's the bank in general. This is the transport sector of the bank and how it compares. The total lending of the bank is around 12 billion per year on all sectors. Still 50% is infrastructure. That's water, sanitation, natural resources, transportation, energy. And of that, around 1 billion, 1.5 billion is what we are lending every year to the countries for the transport sector. It's still a very low number, as you can see. So it's a significant number. $1.5 billion is a big amount of money, but it's very low compared to the needs. So we have to be very strategic and very focused on what we try to do with our funding, and that's where the technical part comes in. But we try to be close to the client, understand the demand, and guess what? The demand is still in interurban roads. And I'm not saying here that we're favoring cars. This is basically the roads to connect production centers with consumption centers and with the ports. It's either paving the roads or expanding the roads, the capacity of the roads, and 80% of our funding goes to those projects because 80% of the demand that the countries are getting are in those projects. 20% is urban transport, the new problem or the new opportunity, and it sounds little, but it came from 0% 10 years ago up to 20%, and I think that's a big success. Ports and airports, we still do mostly to our private sector window, and basically because most of those projects are financially feasible to attract other type of lending, and occasionally we get those in our pipeline, but not quite that often. So, and we are moving from doing a lot of public works, moving into the services side. So we are funding more equipment, we are funding more projects like Transmilenio, where it's a lot of technology involved, a lot of financing of processes or collecting systems and that type of activities. And we are trying to focus in different areas. We have some corporate mandates, and the transport mandates try to adapt to those mandates and to the requirements of the region. For example, one corporate mandate, our owners, which are the countries of borrowers or non-borrowers, are insisting that the bank should concentrate in promoting integration projects that will allow countries to integrate with their neighbors or with the other, or globally with other business partners. And transportation is key there. So that part of infrastructure connectivity is under the transportation division, which I head, and we have to coordinate with energy and other sectors to promote the projects. And it's highly related with other of our strategic areas, which are, we believe, very, very important. One of those is, and I'm going bottom up, develop the freight logistics, which is highly related to integration. We don't have a good infrastructure, but if we don't have a good system to operate the cargo that goes on that infrastructure, well, you could invest millions and have a line of trucks waiting to get to the port to be loaded, and all the economic benefit of that road could be lost in a few days of those queues. And we are trying to go more towards sustainability, broader concept of sustainability than the usual safeguard type of sustainability that we used to seek in multilaterals. I mean, all our projects have to respond to social and environmental guidelines that are best practices in most parts of the developed world, but we are trying to go beyond that, and I try to talk a little bit about it. And there is one which is extremely important in the bank, which is road safety. Still, we talk about road safety, but we're here I'm talking about urban and interurban, because most of the fatalities occur in the urban setting. So let me try to explain a little bit why these strategic areas, and I'm going to go directly to the flagship projects, which help me illustrate a little bit about it. Why road safety is important? Well, it's a complex problem. It's a big problem. 140,000 fatalities per year, millions of wounded people in auto accidents, which are actually not accidents because they are completely preventable. They occur because of reasons that are pretty well known, and that's 1 to 2% of GDP if you measure it. If you try to measure it and there are a lot of limitations to that measurement of what the economic cost of that. If you remember what we were talking about, and this is a message for anyone who works in a finance ministry here, if we remember the initial numbers that I talked about, this could be the funding gap that we need for infrastructure in the long term. So this is what we're talking about, besides the social impact that this could have in our countries. And there is no exception. I don't think there is a Latin American country that we can say that this one is doing really good. And this can be solved. This can get worse, actually, also. Can be solved, but can get worse. We are expecting motorization to go up probably by 50%, even putting in place a lot of urban transport projects, and that's going to probably double this figure in the next 20 years. So it's going to be a real problem. And also it's concentrated in part of the population, which is the youngest part, the vulnerable users. There are pedestrians, cyclists, young people, poor people, and usually heads of family. So the social and economic impact of this type of things. And it's a very difficult problem to solve because it's not only related to infrastructure, it's related to several institutions with the government, it's related to the car production system that we already have in Latin America, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A, but there is a big complexity involved in this. It's a big problem, but it's nobody's problem when you look at the setting of the institutional arrangement around the situation, either public or private sector. Actually, in Colombia, we're having a very interesting intervention that is on preparation now, which is actually the idea is to, Colombia has a lot of funding going to road safety, but they are interested in their development plan to work on creating the institutionality and the structure to be able to put in place a policy for road safety. We have other type of projects in road safety where it's pure engineering, and you can see here a 300 million road project in Argentina, which has 18 million is the cost of the actual investment that you will have to do in those cases to improve up to standards the road safety. So that's one of the strategic areas that we have, road safety. Projects like Transmilenio or urban transport projects are also projects that are related to road safety. There was a study made by Andes University in a couple of the corridors that you have in Bogota, and the reduction of accidentality there was 50%, which is what you are aiming to do with the worldwide, with the United Nations Decade of Action for Road Safety, is what Spain was able to do in a decade. That was already accomplished just by putting in place one BRT. So you see that our strategic areas start to interconnect among themselves. We work in urban transport, at the same time we're working in road safety, and that's the type of policy action that we think could help a lot the systems in the urban transport is also geared to reduce congestion, to reduce emissions. And this is related to our sustainable transport initiative, a strategic area, which starts with putting in place a BRT, but it's more than that. We need to work also in demand, transportation demand-oriented projects. It has to do with planning of the cities, to putting people to live in the places and work in the places where actually the trips don't originate in the first place, so then we don't have to put in place a transportation system and start getting emissions from that. And I'll be almost done. We are also working on different technologies. Metros are starting to come back to the region. Right now we are working with the World Bank and CAF in the Quito Metro, which is under construction, and we are also working in some specific roads that have some special type of complexity. And I'm showing here a particular case in Colombia, which is Pasto Mocoa Road, that has all the complexities that you want to have in technical, in the social, in the environmental part, and also is located in a conflict area in Colombia. That's the type of project that we try to do. to mimic what is done there in other places, small projects like that one, or big projects like the Rodanel of Sao Paulo, which is the big beltway of Sao Paulo. This northern part is $3 billion investment. The bank is financing $1 billion. The whole project, which is a public private partnership as a whole, is $9 billion investment. So it's being done, and in institutionality at the state level in Sao Paulo is something that we should be looking at as an example. And the other part that I was mentioning as a point of focus and I'm almost finished for the bank is logistics. And Colombia is one of the countries that is more advanced in the policy definition part, is centered to the development plan, and the institutionality around logistics is really critical, and that's what Colombia is working on. It's an example for other countries. Mexico is looking very closely to what Colombia is doing, and that's part of it. But the other part of logistics, at the end we will need the projects. The infrastructure projects need to be built, and we are working in projects that are highly related to logistics. Actually, the Sao Paulo Rodanel is a huge logistic project. That's the alternate route to the Santos port, which is the biggest port in Latin America. And we are also working on the expansion of the Panama Canal, which is a $5 billion endeavor. The bank is leading the financing. The IDB is leading the financing group of $2 billion. Our share is $400 million. And that's an interesting project that is putting in place some of the flexibility that Professor de Neufville was talking about in his presentation. So basically, that's what I wanted to say. We have a difficult problem. It's expensive, it's complex, but there is a lot of things to be learned of what is happening in the region. And the IDB the role of the IDB in this is to partner with the governments, share those experiences, and try to take lessons from one place to another. And it's a motive of pride to say that Colombia is really exporting a lot of those ideas, and we are using many of those ideas, particularly in the upstream part of the projects. And I think we have a big challenge in the execution, which I think is the big part that we need to work ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nestor. Keeping on the practice of leaving the questions to a bit later on, we'll now introduce Juan Pablo Bocarejo, who is professor of civil environmental engineering at the Universidad de los Andes. His degrees are French, which is relatively unusual for members of this group, but a healthy difference. He's got his doctorate in transport from the Université de Paris Est, and was at the Institut d'Urbanisme de Paris at Paris 12 along the way. He has a book on sustainable transport called Bogota 21, a Worldwide Metropolis.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the Colombian Embassy, our consul in Boston, the people from the students from the MIT Harvard Club. I'm very happy and delighted to be here. It's an honor to be able to discuss with you some ideas on infrastructure with very brilliant professors and students. So I really want to thank you for this opportunity. So Lina from the National Department of Planning told us about the big challenges, and she spoke about the urban and the national challenges. And Nestor was telling us about the old problem and the new problem. I think that Colombia has done it well in the new problem. So Colombian cities came with very innovative ideas that have been used in several countries. BRTs, cable cars, they have been trying to develop in other cities. So I would like to focus in the old problem. It is probably the old problem for Latin America, but I think it's a huge problem for Colombia. So that's why I want to focus on national infrastructure and logistics. So when you talk to industrial bosses, when you talk about competitivity, about economic development, you always come with some figures and with some ideas that everybody shares in Colombia. So one of the ideas is it is most costly to move goods than to produce them. We have a very important lack of infrastructure all over the countries. So in fact, a couple of months ago, I discovered that there was a country that's called Lesotho. It's a country in Africa. And I learned about the country because it's the same index, infrastructure quality index, than Colombia. So that's kind of, that gives you a kind of idea of the lack of infrastructure we are facing. So taking into account this situation, national government has really tried to put infrastructure as a priority in Colombia for the last 3 years. So we had this background that we were spending less than 1% of GDP in infrastructure, a lot less than the average in Latin America. So we really were trying to improve and give a new background to the infrastructure development. And that's what they call the next generation of infrastructure. And the next generation is focused mainly on concessions, on PPP projects. So what I see when I studied a little some of the documents that set up the policy is that this generation focuses really on some of the aspects that should be taken into account. So we think that one of the problems we face when we develop infrastructure is linked to the legal aspects. So trying to build good contracts is one of the efforts we are trying to do. The other effort we really are trying to put in place is linked to trying to build good projects for the private sectors so that investment have a good rentability. And we also are focusing and we are worried with environmental aspects. But I think there are some very important aspect that is missing, and is finally the engineering aspect. We think that engineering has already been solved, and we are not thinking in many of the engineering aspects that should be addressed. And finally, the question is if with this next generation, we are really succeeding to develop the infrastructure we need. So you can see there are two pictures of what happened to road infrastructure a couple of years ago. That was the result of La Niña phenomenon, it's a very tough flood that we had in the country. So this is a road just outside Bogota, so it should be the most developed part of the country. And this is a road in Santander that is also a rich region of the country. And one of my criticisms and one of the things I think that should be improved in order to have a better plan to develop our infrastructure is having this network analysis. What we are having right now is isolated projects that are, we try to have these projects that are good for the investment and then they give some return, but we are not really building a network. So as we mentioned before, one of the big problems we are having of not taking this as a network is the uncertainty of demand. And another big project is that we are not taking into account vulnerability. So, for example, that's maybe in the next slide, we made this analysis with a model in our research center, and that those are the main links of our network. And we were calculating what would be the cost if I took off one of those links. And this happened all the time in Colombia. You can see the problems we had before. And for example, for getting to our first port, the most important port in Colombia, you only have one road. So when you think on what you should do and what you should invest in terms of network, you should definitely take into account this kind of analysis. And if I should be prepared to address those inconvenience and those difficulties that are caused by natural disasters. And if I only have one link to get to my main port, and if I only have a very bad link to link two of the main principal cities in Colombia, it is not working. So one of the ideas I would try to give to the government is try to really think on a network that wants to be resilient and that wants to be redundant. The other aspects that I think should be reviewed, and I insist is not taken into account because we think that engineering aspects are already solved, is related to the design standards. You can see there a very important road in Santander also, and you can see the kind of design we have. So we had this design that was focusing mainly on trying to save some money, but that is really dangerous and that is really costly in terms of operation. So if we really don't give priority and we don't define the standards, we will have a very limited infrastructure. So I really think that when you think on this big plan of having the new infrastructure for Colombia, you definitely have to define what is the level of service you want to have. You really have to define what are the speeds you need, what are the limits on slopes and curves. That's the basic. And for a long time, our design standard was do the cheapest, but we're getting richer. We want to be more competitive. We have these trade agreements with big countries, so we have to be competitive. And if we don't put an accent on good specifications, we'll have poor infrastructure. The other aspect that is really striking when you look at the plans, the last ones, is you can make a search on different documents and you never find the word road safety. It is just not there. So definitely what we need, and if you look at, for example, the US plans on road, safety has become a very important and a priority in the development of infrastructure. So that's definitely one of the things we have to do. And there are very good examples on how you can include road safety, for example, into concessions, road concessions. So you can give incentives to concessionaries that build safe roads. You can have indicators and you can measure the performance of the concessionaries. You can insist on better standard related to the road safety, and you have to do good enforcement. So definitely, I think that for Colombian infrastructure plans, we have to put a priority into road safety, and it is not there at the moment. And we finally have this very big problem about institutions. So, as I was telling before, the plan is to produce some isolated projects, and we are not creating an homogeneous network. Really, road users don't need to know that we have a concession here and another there. They just really need to have a good network, and they don't care who is the owner of part of the network. We don't have a management of the network. We are not thinking on what should be the priorities of the projects. We are not clear on what should be the maintenance of some of the projects. And we have a big problem in terms of enforcement. And enforcement, of course, linked with road safety. I also have the question about information. Sometimes what is happening with the concessions is that the private keeps the information for himself. And we really need, in order to have better planning, to have information getting to the government, to the researchers, etc. And another big question is related to if we really have the capacity to develop such a big investment. So in the national government, they are talking about, I don't know, $40 billion in investment related to infrastructure network. And it's 20 times higher than what we have developed previously. So I really have the question, how are we going to have the institutional strength to develop these projects? So what I really think that we should work on at trying really to improve the plan of infrastructure we are doing is first have this network approach and not only the project approach. Second, we need to develop those standards and the performance objectives. Third, we need to introduce the vulnerability and the redundancy analysis in order to have a stronger network that really gives us possibilities when we have natural disasters coming. We have to give a very important prioritization to road safety, and we need to strengthen institutions. That should be my advice to the national government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I failed to mention that Juan Pablo is also head of something called the Grupo Sur at the Universidad de los Andes, Group for the South. And SUR, of course, is also the Spanish acronym for Urban and Regional Sustainability. Thanks very much. The final speaker this afternoon is Christopher Zegras. He's a tenured associate professor and career development professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the MIT, and also a member of the Engineering Systems Division that I defined earlier while introducing Professor de Neufville. He have a long career in Latin America. He speaks Spanish with native fluency and has done a lot of work in many countries throughout the Spanish-speaking world. At MIT, he heads the MIT Portugal research program in transportation. That's a large-scale project entailing a number of Portuguese universities. He's also a participant in the MIT Singapore program and has more concurrent projects on various subjects than I can even remember. But he does a great deal of work and is well known to the field.
Well, thank you. I do want to maybe make a slight clarification. Thanks so much, Rob, for the introduction, and to both Nestor and Juan Pablo for the presentations. I was invited, as I understood it, to be a commenter, not a presenter. So thus, you guys are lucky I don't have to bore you with a PowerPoint. Not that PowerPoints are boring, but last session of the day. So I'll do my best to hopefully not make some coherence out of the notes that I've taken. I thought it was a nice string that led from beginning to end of both the sessions this afternoon, at least the sessions I was able to participate in. And I really would like to thank the organizers and congratulate the organizers for putting together such an important event, and for all of the students, I suppose mostly students, others that are here this afternoon. Congratulations to all. Maybe I'll start with the final slide here, because I thought it was it was a very compelling picture you paint of the challenges. But there's a few points I suppose I feel should be explicit, even though they're arguably implicit in your closing remarks. Perhaps it's just because it's my pet peeve these days when we talk about transportation. I feel we fail to convey as users an understanding of, and then we as planners and managers and institutions, the fact that we need to have an explicit transportation finance system. I believe fundamentally. We kind of have one here in the United States, but not really. We talk about gas taxes. If you look back at history, it's actually supposedly a road user fee, not tax. Fees go up just like your phone fee goes up, just like your electricity fee goes up, etc. So we have somewhat of an advantage in the United States, but not really, because it's not quite as explicit as it should be. And then in much of Latin America, which is the place I'm most familiar with, although Portugal as well, we don't either. Now, it's interesting that this is changing somewhat because we're bringing the private sector in. I liked your graph that you showed where we had the heyday, right? The first wave of privatization fever. Ended in around 1990. I don't know exactly the date, but I kind of drew it, whoosh, drops off, right? Now that's either because the private sector got scared away or because they picked up all the juicy projects. And it's probably a combination of the two. But this then, so this leads to a second point I think that needs that we should think about making more explicit here, although again, I think it is implicit. Good PPPs require good public counterparts. Eduardo Engel, who's a Chilean economist who's written a lot on PPPs, I think he's at Yale now, he has this phrase that I love. He says that the approach has always been privatize now, regulate later. Anti-regulatory institutional structures will almost certainly be bad. And it's really hard to regulate right. And Latin America is kind of littered with this problem. And I would say the country I might know best, which is often waving the flag quite high, Chile. Very successful concessions program. My sense is they've also been a bit co-opted by the private sector. Let's not fool ourselves here. I am not anti-PPP at all, but I'm just saying PPP needs to be leveraged and co-opted for the public good, not the private good. I want the private sector to make money, but make money for us because it's public projects we're purportedly developing. The problem also, so again, these two are linked. So we're essentially, for some reason, not willing to make a transport finance system explicit. And the transport finance system, or much transportation, especially in the urbanizing world, the network problem external to the cities is much more challenging, but is rich. There is a lot of demand in the mega cities of the world. I was actually calculating a couple of back of the envelope calculations. You can make a lot of money relatively easily in a pretty equitable way by properly charging metropolitan transportation. I'm not saying we do it right in the United States, please, we do not. We do it very poorly here. We were actually talking between Juan Pablo and I about Singapore, which is where Ralph said I've been doing a lot of work lately. because some Singaporeans were in Bogota consulting on the possibilities to do road pricing, a la the electronic road pricing in Singapore. And the fear there is that the demand is basically inelastic. So if you do away with pico y placa and you put in tarificación vial or por congestión or whatever you want to call it, and let's be clear, it should be called congestion pricing, I believe, you wouldn't reduce demand. And I said, well, that's great, because then it's free money. I mean, you can charge as much as you want. And then you can actually use that money effectively and really improve the transportation system for everybody, for the rich car drivers and for the poor bus riders and for, the pedestrians who need safety improvements. But my own understanding or observation of the use of PPPs is it seems to be the government is doing two things. We're primarily outsourcing the juicy projects. And the fear there is that we basically have a system for the haves, and the haves already have. And then second is we're kind of outsourcing the finance problem. So why should this is interesting. I mean, maybe that's the right approach, but why should the public sector not be willing to charge people just like the private sector does? I think that's clear evidence that we're not taking advantage of a revenue source that should be used to create public good. Okay, enough on that. The other theme that emerged throughout, and I think this links very closely back to what Richard was saying earlier, you had mentioned at the beginning of your talk, you essentially referring to kind of like a rigidity or a vulnerability. You used the 2 weeks of no electricity in Washington, D.C. How the system is at capacity, and that makes it extremely fragile. One link breaks, and you showed infinite loss. If I was reading it right. And so I think that this leads to the need to develop systems that are resilient and robust. And if you look at these terms, technically they're kind of at odds. Because robust means like, you want your space shuttle to be robust, right? I guess, or thing, but resilience means you can just change in the face of dynamics. I think it's along the lines of this flexibility. So I think this is something that we need to figure out how we do in infrastructure networks and transportation system networks. And I think, again, that's where we can leverage the power of the private sector for innovation, as long as we harness the private sector towards what we're trying to achieve, which is resilient and robust transportation systems for the development of our countries. My notes are a little disorganized. I do just want to add one other point, which I think is extremely important, this question of safety and how many of you may be familiar with the Kuznets curve, right? So it was popularized in environmental economics, where everyone pollutes up to some point where all of a sudden you get rich enough to buy your way out of pollution. And traffic safety has a similar curve. Look at Norway, look at the Scandinavian countries. They're all rich, they're all motorized, and they have like the zero death tolerance, and they're reasonably close to achieving that. And so the question is how do we get the world that's not yet motorized to tunnel through? I don't know, right? I don't think it's certainly not an engineering question alone. Engineering has an important role to play. But this leads me, I guess, to a question leads me to a question that I will end with. Because all of the, I think it's extremely apt that you end with these institutional challenges. And transport is an institutional problem. And we know we face it here in the United States, where we're still not really capable of coordinating, even though when you have the bully puppet presidency saying DOT, EPA, HUD, work together, figure it out. They don't. Sorry. Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection, and Housing and Urban Development. Organizations like IDB, multilaterals, they face the same exact challenge in the end. And so I wonder, my understanding is you have these new initiatives, the emerging sustainable cities, and is this a pathway, you think, to help the bank get its client members to become more institutionally nimble to address the problems that we're facing today? I apologize for the disorganization of my presentation. I hope there was something here that was relevant, and I look forward to the conversation. Questions?
Thank you very much, Chris. As you may have noticed, since most people asked to comment on papers actually introduce their own material, I was giving him a lot of leeway, but he didn't take it. He stayed to the task and did respond to the presentations, for which we need to be very grateful, because I think that was a useful thing for him to do in terms of the future discussion. We have a good while for discussion, but maybe since Nestor was addressed by some of these comments, he may have something to say.
Yes, I think, and I probably missed that part because I was rushing at the end, trying to save some time. But at the end, it's a big institutional problem. If you go back to the bank that started originally doing infrastructure, basically what we put in place, the World Bank, the IDB, was very simple that today nobody remembers. Is nobody knew how to contract roads at that point in the 50s in Latin America. So there was these norms to procurement that were created by these organizations, and all the projects started to be done like that. What happened at the end, that was that the countries, most of them, I think, today, have very qualitatively good contracting systems, which are basically an institutional system. It's not, usually they say, no, I have a good contracting law. It's not that. You have a good contracting law, you have someone who has signed the contract, you have the judiciary system who's going to solve any issues regarding the contract. Now the problem actually is us, and that's one of the things, the responses to Dr. de Neufville statements of flexibility, is that we didn't change the procurement part, and now we are stuck with that, and it's very difficult to convince 26 countries here, and I don't know how many in the World Bank, to change the procurement part. But that's to use an example of what what we try to do with the strategic areas. We try to work in the continuity that we have been international public officials, that we are able to stay beyond government terms in a particular country. We can actually stop a project at some point and say, okay, this is not going to work for the next 4 years, and you can actually do it. It will be expensive, but you can actually do it because we have a fiduciary mandate that does not allow us to go away from those mandates that are really, really very inflexible, but are very good in those situations, because the project cost could go up or something like that, but probably the money is not going to be bad spent. That's the type of thing that we're trying to do, because if we are only investing 1.5 billion, and we have that huge problem, we really need to use those 1.5 billion like in a lab to be expanded when the countries use their own money and try to get some of those best practice. Is it road safety? Is it sustainable transport, clean transport projects, or a logistic freight system? That's the idea, I think. But institution is the difficult part to do, and I think it's a matter of time. A lot of presidential terms are needed for those.
Juan Pablo, do you have anything to say before we go to the floor?
Yes, I think you really made the important point, and it is, we are very happy in Colombia that we are working with the concessions, and we've been able to bring some money from the private, but we really need to have the public doing his job, and the job is really having this network approach and having this planning capacity and trying to bring an overall homogeneous vision to the infrastructure. And what we are facing is a very big difficulty to have these institutions. So we are making progress, as I was telling, in legal aspects, and we have very good financial structuring of the projects, but we are forgetting this very important thing of managing as an overall our infrastructure for the future.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. To the floor. Questions? Observation? Yes, sir. Over here.
Oh, the next one. Okay.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentations. I'm Luis Gallo from the Social Investment Bank, and I have a question for Nestor. If you look at Colombia, it's evident that we're lacking infrastructure. We need roads, we need ports, airports, etc. And, many $billion are required. Why do you think the government is so resistant to taking money out of Ecopetrol or ISA or the land bank that the Colombian government owns throughout the country and selling part of it and investing it in a good road system? If we were to take 10% of Ecopetrol, even at the lower values that it trades today, it's more than $10 billion. And that could go a long way in fixing our problems.
I'm not sure the answer to that question is by any means uniquely Colombian, but perhaps there are views. Anything to say?
Well, I don't know. And that's what I wanted to make the statement so open at the beginning, because I think part of the answer is in the sector, and that's, I think, the one that we can really work out. And I think Professor Zegras mentioned very good and very needy what are those, and we can get a lot of money from the, I don't know, just instead of doing a million BRTs or 20 BRTs or whatever BRTs in Mexico, we could do something with the pricing of gasoline there. So I mean, probably is the same type of problem that you have there, and I think it will have to do that. I work a little bit in the energy sector, in the oil business. I still remember some things, but there you have to remunerate the capital for the exploration and the production, which is very expensive, risky, and probably I'm not sure if the profitability is that big as to share, to distribute dividends, which will be what you will actually be doing there when you have that big business. That part I don't know now, because I have been long time away from the energy sector in Colombia. But I would say that it's not. The question is more broad. Is why don't you direct more money from the government to this type of assets, when you know that what you're investing is too low, and basically what you do, trying to optimize through the financial structure, is going to be relatively marginal. It's not going to get you really away from the big gap that you have there. So I don't have an answer to the question, just to be clear, because I don't work with the Colombian government. But my guess is that it's a matter of why are we not directing more capital equity from the governments, and that's in the whole Latin America, I think, into these systems that are public goods. No, I don't know.
I don't think the problem of infrastructure in Colombia is about money. We worked at Universidad de los Andes with Juan Carlos Echeverri, that was the prior Minister of Finance, and we calculated how much we were spending on infrastructure. It was less than 1% of GDP. And when they planned in the actual government the investment, they just gave enough money to develop the projects we need. I really think the big challenge is on managing the growth and managing the development of this new infrastructure. I don't think it's about finding the money.
If you followed at all the recent dialogue on financing of transportation in the United States, I think you'd find very similar circumstances to those of other countries, including Colombia, except that in this country the usual solution is to make an effort to force the investment down to the states and local entities which can't afford them in Colombia, and increasingly may have troubles with them here. Further question? Yes, sir. Up here.
Hello, my name is Daniel Uribe. I'm an undergraduate student at Bentley University. And my question is, if you could talk a little bit about the consequences of the recent changes of the Colombian government's bidding process for concessions, now that they're not going to give monetary advances for the companies that win those concessions. Maybe some positive, negative consequences.
Yep, that's the kind of legal aspects that I was referring to, that we are trying to change. So every generation we have discovered that there were some lacks in the previous contracts, so we try to improve that. So first generation, we decided that we would give a guaranteed demand. So if You had to have a number of cars, and if you didn't have those cars in your road, government would pay you. And we have paid a lot of money to the concessionaries. Second generation was, okay, just build when you have enough traffic. So it was like a progressive, flexible kind of investment. And we said, you can start picking up money, and when you have enough money, you can start building. I think that was a bad idea. And now, because of the corruption, etc., we have decided that, okay, we don't give you any money. You have to build, you have to take the risk, and after that, you can start taking the tolls. So I think it is good for the people, for the users, because they will have finally some kind of decent infrastructure before they are charged. I hope it works.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Diego Bustamante. I'm coming from Columbia University. If I may, I have two questions real quick. One is, we talked about the rural development gap. And when you go to these areas that are the most marginalized in the periphery of the country, and you ask about their three priorities, their response is roads, second roads, third roads, and they don't have anything else. They don't have health, education. They're lacking security probably, but that's their answer. And when it comes to the mandate of the government to invest in those roads, there are clear constraints because the system is organized in a way that the local municipalities end up being responsible for what we call the tertiary road systems, right? And those roads are the less profitable when it comes to PPPs. So any ideas on a sustainable financing methodology for investing in those particular rural tertiary roads? And second is, what do you make of the increasingly recurrent roadblocks, literally, that have to do with the environmental impact of all these road development in Colombia that are clearly present, I mean, throughout the whole network of road systems, and new projects are constantly being blocked because of their environmental impact in the natural reserves, natural parks in some of these regions that are really, really important to connect.
I can take maybe the first part. I can take both, but let me take the first part and then and I can come back to the second one. That's one of the big challenges, and I strongly think that there is no different structure than just putting the money. I mean, you need to put the money and get it through the channels to the right political area. Or I mean, if it's a municipal or the department who has to do the rural roads, then give them the money, and they will do it. You will also need to do a lot of institutional strengthening, because I was using the example of the $20 million asset. It's a very, very expensive asset if you don't have a management capability in a municipality to do it. And there are several technical ways to do it. You can group the network, you can build it, and give out the maintenance for 5 years to the private sector, but it's not that they are going to charge a toll for that. You will pay in a fixed price, or you will do performance-based contracts where you will ask for, you should give me this level of service and I will pay you, just like if he was providing water. But that payment has to come from the government, and that's related to Luis' question, and I think it's the same question that came after that. This is capital-intensive type of work, and you need to pay to companies that have the ability to respond for that money, and that they do not exist because of the contract. They are real companies that have equity, and then they are able, and they have the capacity to manage the money. These monies, which are monies from everyone, it's not monies from them. So I think it's very aligned, the question of Ecopetrol and the financing part of that Luis was mentioning with the prior one, that why are we giving advances to contractors? Because when they should have the equity to buy their own equipment and to have the working capital, here is more or less the same thing. You need to have in the public sector and in the private sector enough capacity, which is Pablo's point, to manage that amount of money. But going back to your question, there is no other way than putting public sector money there. There is no other way. You can spread out in time, you can do tricks, you can pay it in down payment and something like that, but it's the same money. I don't know if someone wants to take the...
In the tertiary roads, there is something interesting. It's about maintenance, because maintenance is really the big cost. Building new roads, it's expensive, but maintaining in a good standard everything, that is very, very expensive. And the good thing is sometimes you can involve community in some maintenance situation, and it's very good for employment. And so I really think that we should develop some kind of strategy to improve those tertiary roads. Definitely it is public money. You cannot not do anything else. Probably it's the department that should take it, part of this investment.
I'll just add a little. I agree exactly with what Nestor said, and Juan Pablo. But the question of so the National Road Network, the global experience empirical shows, and it's totally intuitive, diminishing returns. The first ones are the big bang for the buck, but of course, where does the buck come from? So if you had a national investment strategy where you were picking off your expected NPVs, right? But then there's the equity dimension, which is not as easily valorizable, right? But I don't know if just go to the oil money. But the tertiary one is quite interesting, and I think they're related because I completely agree. You need to give some of the ownership responsibility locally, because evidence, in fact, shows when you give it locally, the localities are willing to respond. But you have to endow them with some capability to respond, meaning either they have some local revenue generating capabilities themselves, or they have grant-based mechanisms that have the right strings attached so that they don't then just spend the money wastefully. But give them some ownership and responsibility, and the evidence suggests that in fact they will respond.
Professor de Neufville.
So on tertiary roads to remote places like the Llanos or other kind of places, I mean, one of the things you should also keep in mind is not to have construction solutions to operational problems. I mean, what they really want, I think, and often, is connectivity. And there are a lot of places like most of Canada, they below the section that's right next to the United States, or Alaska, or all kinds of places, where or Brazil, where the policy in many ways is to provide aviation. I mean, to subsidize the aviation, because maintaining 1,000 meters of a runway is a whole lot easier than maintaining 100 kilometers of roads through the jungle or through the Llanos, which is sort of difficult to wash away. And you have to pay operational costs, but it may be, in fact, the better way to do it. And there are a lot of ways to finance it, but we mustn't think that roads are always a solution to the essential problem of connectivity. And I'm not speaking only for airports, but also in the Llanos you have the water highways, the waterways, which are also possible.
Oh, you have a question.
It's on? Okay. So I agree to some extent that money is a relevant issue, but in the past Colombia has money for infrastructure investment. So if my memory is correct, we received in the first half of the 20th century $25 million as compensation for the loss of Panama, and that money was poorly invested in rail infrastructure that leads to nowhere and with different gauge and connectivity problems. So it seems to me that we need to address all of those issues, and there's very little improvement we can make by addressing only one of them, which is what the government is doing with the public-private partnership law. So yesterday we were at a meeting with the rector of Universidad de los Andes, and he asked us not to give him ideas, but to tell him what he should do next Monday. So I don't know if our panelists could suggest a strategy for our government or for a group of people to start addressing those issues next Monday. Thank you.
You had 4 days.
Yeah, can I get back to you on Monday?
Yeah, I think Ministry of Transport has to really take his responsibility, and is planning and is prioritize and is developing models to have the network approach. I think they're starting to doing it. So they really need to work on that, on keep on working on the network approach. I think it's not so difficult to have standards of design of the network, and if you really want to have successful private investment, you must know from the beginning what kind of quality you need. So that is it's easy to do, really. I don't know, producing a manual or something that is very strong on the quality of the network we need. At least the main network, maybe we can have some levels of quality depending on the demand we have. We also, I also think that we have methodologies to work on vulnerability, and it is just to have clear in mind the decision makers should include this kind of analysis. It is not very difficult to do it. It is not very expensive to do it. But I think they have never thought on introducing the vulnerability factor into the network analysis. We are in the decade of road safety, and we have plans to improve that. And Nestor was telling that the IDB is willing to support countries on road safety. So that's something that we've been working on, and we need to put all the strength to improve that. I think the most difficult aspect is really strengthening institutions. So when a good governance leaves, we have like the security that we have the technical capability to keep on going. I think that's the very difficult part in this moment. And we count that young people then like you will go back to Colombia and help us with that.
I think, can I get the Monday thing? I think I have too many Mondays, so if I was going to get another Monday, I will actually pick up some of the lessons of Luis Gallo in the morning. I think a little bit what a CEO will think of his company if I were either the director of a departmental secretary of public works or in BIAS, or I will think next Monday what I want to be doing with my people in my organization in the 5th year after now, and try to stay there for 5 years. That should be the aim. And I think that's related with what Pablo was saying. Institutions is about people, and people and institutions die if people go away. And I think the real work that is necessary is to find ways to keep technical people in the organizations. So it's better to have average people for a long time than the excellent, what should I say here, Stanford engineer for 1 year in one of these agencies. I think that's the key, is trying to have stability in the institutions, so you have some learning on all those processes and try to apply those. If I was to get another Monday in the Colombian government, I will do that.
Very good.
Now that I've bought my time, I will just quickly respond. I think it would go back to my earlier comment that, and it's, I think, consistent with these two. I'd say that it would be, you do well to make the transportation system, public finance system explicit. You know, the rules are there, we know how to do it. Look at the fiscal federalism, administrative ease, efficiency, equity, budget constraints. And from there, you know, the famous Watergate case, right, here in the United States, Deep Throat says, follow the money. follow the money. By following the money, you will actually help lead the system to more efficient and resolving many of the issues that we've been talking about here. And do it in such a way that you enable local innovation, which I think the Colombian local governments are quite capable of being able to do, but use that money to incentivize local innovation, because that's where the true solutions will bubble up from.
My name is Juan Felipe Celia. I'm a student at Bentley University. And my question is regarding, for example, the congestion and traffic crisis there is, for example, in cities like Bogota. So I'm sure Juan Pablo knows, has experienced. Because, implementing transportation systems inevitably takes time. They're complex processes, and complex and expensive. So my question is, what recommendations do you have in terms of policies that are easier to implement? For example, similar to pico y placa, or maybe taxing the externality in a way that increases the incentive for people to choose public transportation, I don't know, bicycles, walking, whatever, over using their cars. And because, for example, the traffic in Bogota is awful. It's awful, and I think in Barranquilla, we're not there yet, but I think we're getting there, and it concerns me. So my question is, what policies would you recommend that are easy to implement in the short term?
Sometimes we have the idea that the problem in Bogota is we have too many cars, and it is not true. In fact, only 20% of the travel in Bogota is done by car. 80% is done by other means. And the other indicator that tells us that there is not a car problem is the motorization rate. So we have less than 20 out of 100 people having a car. So it's very low if you compare to other cities. I really think that our problem of congestion is not that we have few roads or that we have too many cars, is that we have a very poor traffic management, for example, that we have a very poor road design, that we have an obsolete road traffic light systems. So I think we can do a lot of engineering, we can do a lot of ITS to improve the situation, and definitely I think that trying to work on the demand side can be also useful. So trying to charge the cars. We're starting a big project. Universidad de los Andes is participating in looking for a congestion charge in Bogota. So I really think pico y placa is a very bad idea. It's in terms of economic, it's very costly. So I think we have alternatives, and I really think if we get better in traffic management, we can really improve things. Of course, the main thing is improving public transport. If you don't give an alternative to the owner of the car, you won't do anything.
Well, it's been an interesting, yes.
My name is Carlos Mikkelsen, and I'm a student at Babson College, and I have a question regarding trains. Like very big and powerful nations around the world use trains as their main mode of transportation, both for people and for products. For many years, this was also true for Colombia. Do you think a train network could be reestablished in Colombia? Is it viable economically and also physically due to our mountainous territory?
Well, I think in that the rail question on freight is quite straightforward. If you have the cargo, you should be able to move it by freight if you have volumes and long distances, and you have a lot of positive externalities of lower emissions and efficiencies in cleaner transport that you could help you adjust a little bit your threshold of net present value lower. No, that's probably the way that we are thinking now in the multilaterals, and that can be done for freight. For passengers, it's a little bit more tricky, I think, and in Colombia, actually, Colombia is working a lot on that, and they have the advantage that at this point, with the one of the potential of the mining boom is that you have actually some possibilities to develop some networks related to the mining, and if that's the type of infrastructure that if you do it right and well planned, when the mining boom goes down, the infrastructure will stay, and you can probably use it. It will be paid off, and then you can start increasing other type of mobilization of cargoes that probably won't be feasible today, but cost of transportation will really go down because the investment was already paid by the mining. That's the type of thing that I think ANI is doing today in the structuring. It's very, very hard to do. It's very hard to do. There are a lot of but I think it's a effort that is good to try on. Suburban trains and passenger trains, well, that's a different story, and there is a boom some places in that area, and I would love to know what Professor Zegras says about this. But for example, Mexico is investing in suburban trains, and there is a rationality there. There are other rationalities, but the technical rationality that I understand they have is close to the state of Mexico, trying to deconcentrate the city. The city is huge. It's 18 million people, so any effort to move away or stop people coming to Mexico City to live, I think even if you don't get the initial traffic of the suburban rail, probably it's a good idea to have something like that, no? And but are expensive and are risky. And I think more important than being able to build it or to say that I'm going to fund it is to know what will happen if you are not able to get the demand that you were expecting. And do you have the funding, the local budget or the existing public resources that you have in that state or in that country, in this case Colombia, are enough to pay for the system if it fails until demand picks up? That's probably what I will look at initially. And I think there are suburban projects that they were being mentioned in the presentation today for transport, public, for passenger transport. I will take a view like that, more than be very overanalyze the demand, for example. I will be more looking at what will happen if demand goes wrong or cost goes high. I think the approach there could be probably the best way to go. I don't know, if you want to.
In terms of freight, Colombia had two big concessions, that kind of network, in the north and in the Pacific. And both of the concessions finished because the concessionary gave up. It was too costly, it was not a good business. So what I think they are trying to do now is really concessioning small projects where you have really enough demand, for example, coal or very specific products to guarantee that it is not, it is a good business for the private. I think one of the difficulties we have is really calculating external costs for the trucks and charging the trucks. So it is very cheap to move freight by truck if you compare it with the trains. So if you put in place, and that's I think what European countries are doing, some kind of tariffs, real tariff to the truck, train will be more competitive in terms of freight. In terms of passengers, I think different cities in Latin America have good experience with trains, like Buenos Aires. Santiago, Chile also is trying to develop a suburban rail. I think the big difficulty is in terms of costs, mainly costs. If you compare, for example, for Bogota, if you compare a train with a bus system for the number of people that is going to be deserved, there is a very big difference. We don't have so much people living in Chia or living in Mosquera. Not enough people to make a train affordable. So that's the big problem, I think.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points to that. So the freight issue, I completely defer, and being extremely ignorant about Colombia's overall geography and topography, I imagine there's a couple of corridors where rail is viable for freight, and if it is, it's definitely viable for freight, not passenger. I mean, well, for reasons I think that are relatively obvious. At the urban level, that you mentioned the Mexico case. So Mexico City, the one I'm familiar with, is they call them there the trenes de cercanía. You know, we call them here as suburban trains. The concessioned out originally, as I understand it, to a private Spanish company. The challenges were twofold. One is in the demand forecast. They assumed overly optimistically, obviously, that the bus services would be reorganized as feeder services. They had no control over it, and the bus services continue running right alongside the train, and everyone takes the bus because it's cheaper and it gets them roughly door to door. They have not resolved that problem as far as I understand. Part of the reason for choosing the alignment was because it was an old freight corridor, so it was cheap. You know, they just brought the trains in, rehabbed but it basically is not making money for anyone, and it was probably a low rate of return for society. I think in the greater Cundinamarca region, potentially interesting, although again, I don't know the network topography, etc., but I could imagine potentially a longer term growth strategy where you might say decentralize a bit Bogota in value a joint development type model. Because suburban trains also are not viable unless the distances are somewhat long. It's just like the rail versus air intercity question. At some point, it just doesn't make sense to have rail. But if you could do it in a way where you decentralize strategically to kind of lessen the pressures in Bogota, but did it in a way where you made it viable for a private investor by giving them some property rights and allow them real estate development opportunities so they could capture some of that value. There might be a model, but in general, I don't know nearly enough about the local context to speak intelligently to it.
The last question, perhaps, here.
Yeah, it was very similar. I'm Santiago Osa from TOPS University, environmental engineering. And earlier today, Lina mentioned that as plans are being made for the future network transportation, there is this idea or this desire of recuperating railroads and river transport. And I wanted to ask Professor Juan Pablo Bocarejo, and I guess anyone else, to what extent, as you mentioned that we're moving from isolated projects to making a bigger network nationwide, to what extent do you consider that this would be possible?
The river, I think it is interesting, but as you mentioned, in order to work, the river has to be connected to the road network, and you have to develop nodes, intermodal nodes, and that is costly. So every few years, a country comes and say, okay, give me the river, and I'm going to make it work. So Chinese have done that, Japanese, etc. So I think a lot of engineering can be done to improve rivers. They have done very simple things like put in some kind of instrument so you can navigate at night, and that's not so expensive, and that gives you a lot of more capacity. So it becomes more competitive with other modes. So I really think a river can be an option if you can really link it with the rest. If you don't do that, it will not work. Some companies like Sofasa, Renault in Medellin, some of the assets they need to produce, they bring it by river. Another interesting example is the banana in Urabá. So there is a very interesting link, river link, between the production zones and the ports. So I really think river has it's not so expensive, and it has some potential.
Lady at the top.
from Columbia University. My question is around those lines about for Nestor, and I want to know about best practices. If you know any Latin American countries where the governments have been able to lower the transportation costs. Because I know in Colombia is one of the issues that we have to be competitive in the international market is that we have very high transportation costs. So I just wonder if Nestor or any of the panelists know any country that has done well and something that could be replicated in Colombia.
Well, I think it's hard to think like on one specific thing that you can replicate. I'm going to say what I say at the end. We're replicating a lot of things that are being done in Colombia in other places, and that's important to keep in mind. But I think that well, transportation costs will go down, and that's particularly when you already had infrastructure. The logistics part, for example, in cargo, if you're talking about that, what is being done in Colombia is being replicated in Mexico, for example. So I wouldn't go about that. What I think Colombia needs to improve, and it's a lot of the discussion that the current government is having among themselves, is in the execution of projects, and there is a lot to learn. And I think Brazil is one of the places, and I think in Brazil, Sao Paulo is one of the places, and there is a specific agency, DERSA, who is really, really good in managing big projects of concessions and roads, and is an example of institutionality. And the type of project that they are doing, well, anything that you do in Sao Paulo will have a significant impact in transport costs. Like the road tunnel that I was mentioning is something that is worthwhile to look at, because it really has an impact in the cost reduction for a big chunk of the cargo of Brazil, because Santos is the biggest project in Brazil, the biggest port in Brazil, and anything that you do to improve the mobility and reduce the cost of those trucks that go around Sao Paulo is going to have a significant impact. That's one example that I will look at, particularly in how to manage this type of projects, and the planning structure that they have is really, really good. I don't know if anyone wants to take on that.
This has been an interesting discussion. On the one hand, on the other, a bit disappointing in the sense that the field seems not to find it easy to come up with new instruments and opportunities for finance and achievement. The governor of Cundinamarca was proposing recently, not too recently, to use the existing rail facilities surrounding Bogota to develop, which are out of service, to develop commuter train service. And I argued at that time for the fact that trains were going to be very awkward for that purpose, and he ought to consider paving over the tracks and installing BRT instead. I don't know what's happened to that recently, but things like this emerge. I wish we had found solutions for the problems of public-private participation, and I keep wondering if we didn't miss tricks by finding ways to strengthen the regulation of those agreements in such a fashion as to make it better than permitting it to fail on account of being either scared off or doubting the possibilities of financial success on it. The question of unsolved capital needs and other needs remains a very difficult one to answer, because, of course, roads are and transportation facilities at large are an extremely large part of the public budget. I keep wondering why there isn't more success with dealing with the traffic accident rate and fatalities all over Latin America. I don't think I know many Latin American families that don't have at least one member who's been badly injured or killed in a vehicle accident. And the comparison of accident rates with Western Europe and the North in general is incredible in terms of magnitude, and you would think should generate political energy, even among people who have a recollection of its consequences, to take action. Wouldn't it be possible? Freight was mentioned. although it didn't get much discussion. The subject of logistics is becoming increasingly interesting in Latin America and in Colombia. And I'm asking myself if we couldn't organize more support from industry, because they're the guys to save money by spending money on that. I look around and I see initiative and creativity on the part of certain, the initiatives taken in a lot of principal cities have been taken by mayors who are relatively strong people in their position. Lerner of Curitiba, Peñalosa of Bogota, Mahuad of Quito, and so forth. And it delivers one sort of sparkling contrast with our own experience up here, where relatively little initiative of these kinds have been undertaken or have been successful. And it occurs to me to note that a lot of these cases in Latin America have been undertaken by powerful mayors, in some cases only a step away from the national presidency of their countries, whereas in the United States, as far as I know, no mayor of any American city has ever become president of the United States, which is an interesting observation, I think. And it suggests that mayor up here is a different kind of a job and one with more surrounding barriers. Well, but I've enjoyed all of this. Hope you have. And I want to thank our speakers very much for their participation, and for all of you guys who have asked questions and participated in the discussion. And we'll see you all tomorrow morning, won't we? 9:30.
So here's tomorrow's program, and